I'm Sean Zadig. I'm the CISO of Yahoo, and you are listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 468 for February 16th, 2026. We got a great interview for you today. We're going to be talking with Sean Zadig. He is the current Yahoo Chief Information Security Officer, CISO or CISO. And it's not that often we get to talk to a sitting CISO. So this is going to be a great opportunity. Sean likes to call himself the Chief Paranoid, as he is the leader of a group at Yahoo. The security folks call themselves the Paranoids. I will, of course, ask him what that means and why they call themselves that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about security for kids today and privacy and some of the dangers they face and what we could do to protect them and kind of interest them in maybe even getting into a career in cybersecurity. Sean also has a law enforcement background. He was actually working at NASA, so there's some interesting stories to be had there. But he's come at some of this data and forensic stuff from both sides. So it's an interesting opportunity to talk about those aspects of fighting crime while also maintaining data privacy as much as possible. So real quick, before we get into the interview, as usual, I want to go over a couple terms we throw out. We talk about GRC. I'm pretty sure he's talking about governance, risk, and compliance there. And we talk about COPPA or COPPA. That's the COPPA, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. That's the law that the way most people run into this is they don't allow kids under 13 to have accounts, so at least not without parental say-so. And also we briefly mentioned the Clipper chip. This was basically a hardware device that was going to be used as a backdoor for law enforcement that was ultimately squashed, but it was part of, what we'd like to call the crypto wars back in the 90s. So with that background, let's get straight to our interview with Sean Zadig. Sean is the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, at Yahoo, where he leads the Paranoids, the team that safeguards the data systems and people powering Yahoo's products and platforms. He brings over 2 decades of experience building and leading teams that evangelize safety and security within organizations. Welcome to the show, Sean.
Kerry, it is really cool to be here.
I am so glad you're here. I appreciate you doing this. It's tough to get sitting CISOs to come on podcasts sometimes, so I very much appreciate that. And you've been Yahoo CISO, I think, if I did the math right, about 6 years now, coming up on 6 years.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, you wrote this kind of interesting article called Being Suddenly a CISO. And so before we get into this too deeply, tell me a little bit about how you became CISO, what kind of things that you have learned as a CISO. And I have to ask, because this is on everybody's minds, how has AI and tools like chatbots that can write malware and create flawless phishing campaigns, how has that affected the neighbor of cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions to start with. I guess, first off, how I kind of got here, and 6 years it feels like yesterday that I became CISO.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as that sort of article you mentioned sort of implies, like that was not my plan. And so I still kind of marvel that this is where I've ended up. But I'm very happy to be here. So, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of my journey in a little nutshell. My background is in cybercrime and sort of fighting cyber criminals and spies and that sort of thing. We actually used to work for the government back in the day. And, when I joined the private sector, I was just figured I would just sort of fight cyber criminals. And, that would be where I was the most happiest. But then really coming to Yahoo and learning about the scope and scale and the challenge of defending, hundreds of millions of users around the world against all sorts of adversaries and threats, really kind of got me excited about the broader portfolio of cyber and was very open to the opportunity when it became available. And I think now that I've been in the role for 6 years, I guess that article that you referenced really sort of talked about that transition from a subject matter expert, when for me that was sort of incident response and forensics and threat intelligence, and then how I made the transition to become a CISO and what I needed to really do. And sort of the genesis of that was I needed to almost ignore my comfort zone and focus on the other aspects of a modern security organization, which includes things like engineering and GRC and cloud and infrastructure security and the areas that I wasn't comfortable in, and spent a lot of time there. And knowing that the team that I had helped build and operate they'd be fine. And I still love to come back and when we have an incident, which, thankfully is rare, I do hop in and I kind of I'm asking questions of the team, and I try not to get in the way, but I do, my background in incident response and forensics does. I'm always like, hey, well, have you thought about this? What about that? And once in a while, I make good suggestions, so it makes me feel like I'm, I still got it, basically.
All right. So AI, how has that impacted things? Because that's certainly, we've had AI for, decades, but the LLMs in particular and have really come on strong. And script kiddies are now using it to write perfectly valid malware. So, and phishing campaigns, how has that impacted your work as CISO?
I think, there's two aspects, right? If we're thinking about generative AI, and I say generative because you mentioned, AI has been with us for a long time, and Yahoo actually has been we've had 20 plus years of traditional machine learning and AI, but generative AI has the possibility of significantly changing my day to day, but it hasn't yet. And I guess there's sort of two aspects to that. One is how we use AI as a security team, and I think that is changing on a daily basis and for the better. But then there's how are the adversaries using AI, and we're starting to see that, but we haven't seen the sort of to use the wrong term, the killer app yet of malicious use of AI. Now, certainly a lot of the guidance we used to give, say in spotting, social engineering or phishing campaigns, look for the bad, grammar, or, look for something seems off. That doesn't apply anymore, because you can certainly use AI to generate really convincing looking social engineering campaigns. But we've not yet seen, knock on the fake wood in front of me, we haven't really seen a major adversary leveraging generative AI in a coordinated campaign against us yet. And it's sort of like the tried and true basic methods are still what the bread and butter of most attacks are.
Yeah. Well, Anthropic just had that write-up recently about that coordinated AI attack, which I thought was fascinating.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I would think of business email compromise and spear phishing and things. With AI, I could just point, these tools at, go look at this person's social media feed for the last 3 months, look up these 3 presentations they did, and craft me an email that looks like it came from them, and send it to their secretary, or their EA or whatever. It just seems like that's going to be so much easier now.
And and I think we will start to see that. And, a lot of attackers and adversaries, there's a sort of underground as a service model where, it's an economy, and people.
It is.
Yeah. So and that's always been the thing about cybercrime that has always really interested me was you don't need to know everything. You just need to know who to ask. And sometimes you don't have to be a cyber whiz at all. You just come, you have some money, and you can cobble together a really effective campaign by going to these different actors who offer a service. And whether it's, cash out and money laundering, whether it's initial access, whether it's malware writing, whether it's crafting social engineering campaigns and lures, you can put together an end-to-end cybercriminal enterprise that could be making millions of dollars or more a year with very little knowledge. And I think we're going to see actors in these underground forums and marketplaces start to offer more agentic AI assisted offerings.
For sure. You call yourself the chief paranoid and head of the paranoids. So this phrase, as far as I can tell, predates your becoming CISO. So what is the origin of that phrase, and what does paranoid mean to you in the context of cybersecurity?
Yeah, so the phrase, we've actually tried to do a bit of archaeology to figure out when did it first come.
Yeah.
And we think around 1999, 2000 or so. So definitely going back, predating me and most of the folks I work with here at Yahoo. So we don't know quite the origin, but we find it very apt. And the paranoids, I like to think of it as I am paranoid and my team is paranoid because we don't want our users to be. We want our users to have, Yahoo like to think we call ourselves the trusted guide to the internet. And we really want our users to not worry about, all the dangers of the internet, scams and spam and, now disinformation campaigns and all sorts of things that can be bad or just unpleasant. And of course, you mentioned AI, like AI slop and, not trusting what, the internet now is telling you. That is an experience that we don't want for our users. And so when it comes to the security and crime aspects of that, my team and I are paranoid, so our users don't have to be. They don't have to think about that. And it's also kind of a fun, kind of quirky name that really sort of like helps us internally with our population of employees talk about some, sophisticated and sometimes scary concepts in a way that is lighthearted and easy to understand.
Well, and I like the approach too, and I wish we had more of that, is where, I don't necessarily want to nerf the internet or nerf our services, but I don't like that we blame the victims a lot of times. And I don't like that we put so much pressure on the average user who doesn't know this stuff. Are you really going to change the minds of 2 billion people and change their daily habits? Or can you just fix this at the source, or maybe not present them with these things? And so, we definitely need to be doing better in that regard. It sounds like that's where you're coming from.
Yeah, we have a saying that we want the safe choice to be the easy choice and eventually the default choice. And so asking our users, whether they're employees at Yahoo or whether they're, consumers around the world, to become security experts just to navigate the internet is, it's not really possible and it's not fair. And so we definitely want to meet them where they are as opposed to making them come to us. And I think, that's the way to succeed and to, make everybody safer.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Okay. So there's a lot of things I could talk to you about. You've had a lot of interesting stuff in your background, but I wanted to pick two topics for today. And first of all, I know you do a lot of work around cybersecurity and kids. And I also happen to know, because let's do a podcast you did recently, you have a young son who's like you, very interested in technology and probably computers. So what are they teaching kids today about, in school about cybersecurity and the internet? I'm curious. I've got 2 daughters, but they're out of school now. So I'm curious what they're teaching them now. And then I'm just curious, being a parent of a kid, a technical person, what are you teaching your kids about this?
So I actually have 3 kids. I have a 7-year-old, I have a 12-year-old, and then I have a 14-year-old who's turning 15 in about a week. And they all have technology integrated into their schooling in some way, whether it's, kind of like technology-enabled classrooms, whether it's completing and submitting assignments online. Everybody's got an email address. I mean, my 7-year-old doesn't, but certainly the older 2 kids do. And there's not a lot of education provided by the school in terms of like what, there's like what I would call like an acceptable use policy. Here's what you shouldn't do. You agree to these things, but there's not a really good foundation in, just sort of being safe online, which is unfortunate. And I think
internet hygiene.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that I certainly wish I knew when I was a kid. And even, things were very different back then. But yeah, so there's actually not, even though there's a ton of technology in their daily lives, there's not a lot of education that comes with it. And I think that's something that I've tried to rectify on my own, in my own family. And that's also something that the Paranoids as an organization try to do. And so we actually will do things like we'll go to schools, primarily in the sort of areas in the communities around where we have offices, or we'll have like, Take Your Child to Work Day. We'll do a presentation for kids who come in about internet safety and staying safe online, and, talk about things that are interesting to them, like gaming and how to prevent, your account from getting hacked if you're playing Fortnite or something, and making it kind of more relatable to their, not just to their sort of vocabulary, but also the problems they're probably facing on a daily basis.
Cool. All right. Well, as you said, kids today are definitely digital natives. I mean, they've grown up with this. It's just a part of their life, which was not this case for you and I. Certainly not the internet. And, they just take this stuff for granted. And I worried that they don't, well, they certainly, just by virtue of being young, they don't have the experience and the maturity to understand the consequences of some of the things they do. But also the internet, I always told my kids, the internet's forever. Whenever you post something there, just assume that it could come back. Now, I don't care what the app promises you about not being able to take screenshots, or it doesn't matter that it's encrypted if your person on the other end is showing it to someone else who could take a photo of it, right? I mean, they just don't have that frame of reference. And as we've determined, they're not being taught this stuff in school. So how do we get kids today who just take this stuff for granted to care about things like security and privacy. And, and then taking it one step further, we need to create career paths for people in these kind of things. We need to get them interested in these things because Lord knows we need a lot more people in security out there working on this stuff. So how do you think we should do that?
Yeah. So the career path thing is especially hits home for me. And I guess I didn't mention this earlier too much, but I did work in the government, which I did say, but I was actually a federal agent and doing cybercrime investigations. And I, as a federal agent investigating hackers, a lot of those hackers were either kids or were young people who didn't have a lot of creative outlets for their hacking activity. And so they were just like I was, like my son is, very interested in, how technology works, how systems work, how you can exploit them and sort of trick them into doing things that maybe they're not intended to do, the sort of intellectual challenge of that. But then certainly when I was an agent 15 years ago or so, there weren't a lot of great opportunities to then use that in a constructive way. And so it was really disappointing to me when I was, whether I was investigating actual kids or whether I was, investigating, say, scammers in West Africa who were very well educated and had, degrees in IT and computer science, but they didn't have a lot of opportunities to leverage that in a legitimate way. They would use those skills for ill instead of for good. And I do think now there are a ton of opportunities for that. And so, I've talked to my son who, again, is really interested in hacking and penetration testing. And, he's at his current school and certainly at his prior school was always in a very helpful way, but always sort of finding the loopholes and finding the vulnerabilities in the web-based, administration that, or, account management or whatever of their school. And I would always be like, okay, well, you got to go tell, the IT team about that so they can fix it. And we've talked about when he gets a little older, like looking at bug bounty programs where the minimum age is often 16. And that's a great way to start, in a legal and fully sanctioned way to, to flex those muscles, but then also to maybe even get paid and make a bit of a name and for yourself even before you get out of high school.
So for the regular kids who might not be as technically inclined, how do we impress upon them that privacy is important and reducing with the information that they share and questioning when someone says, well, you need to fill out this information and turn that in. Do I? Why? Could I give you less information? I worry actually privacy more than security, because I think security maybe is more obvious and privacy certainly today is not. Do you have any ideas for how we might inspire kids today to care? Because it does, again, it sounds like the schools are probably not doing this.
Yeah, I agree that privacy is a harder concept to get across than security. Security is sort of there's locks on the door. There's, there's alarms at the bank. You kind of understand the need for security, but privacy is a kind of concept that's a little more abstract, and the timeline of the impact of when privacy sort of is affected is longer. And your privacy might be impacted now, and maybe there's a leak, or maybe you share information online you shouldn't, but you don't see the negative effects of that until maybe years later.
Right.
I think the way to get there is, and this is actually a technique I use a lot at Yahoo, is through storytelling. And so it's not just here's what to do and here's what not to do, but really providing the context and talking about when controls fail, or when things go wrong and what we learn from it. And I think so my background before getting into security, actually, I was in IT, systems administration, and there was such and I hope this isn't the case today, but back, 25, 30 years ago, there was a bit of a culture of almost ridiculing the end user. And there was this term, I worked help desk for a while, and there was a term called PEBCAC. Are you familiar with this? So,
I am.
Yeah. So problem exists between keyboard and chair.
Yeah.
And that was basically saying the user's an idiot. And now when I think about that, I wince, because that's a case where we didn't, we clearly did not explain as professionals the technology they were using, why they needed to do a certain thing. And so when I think about now how to educate, whether it's kids, whether it's employees or consumers, telling a story in terms they understand and talking about, what the context is and then what the effects could be, that sticks in your brain. Stories stick in your brain a lot more than metrics and facts. Like I remember a book or a movie I saw much better than,
right.
a percentage or something.
Right.
So a good example might be, and I'm not going to use a company name here, but there was a fairly well-known DNA testing company that made a ton of really great privacy assurances, and they had a really strong privacy policy. Well, they went bankrupt, and now there are other companies who are trying to purchase that data, and they do not have to honor those policies. And so that's a good example of like who you are as a person. Your genetic code might be then bought by these unscrupulous parties who could use it in ways that you never consented to. And that's a great example of the internet and information you provide to it being forever.
Right. And I think Cory Doctorow likes to call it the Darth Vader contract. Like, I've altered the deal. Pray I don't alter it further. Right. It happens all the time. You get an email saying we've changed our term of service, and by continuing to use our product, you agree to this. And that's the way a lot of this stuff works now. And so, yeah. And then, of course, buyouts. I really wish there was some way to automate the notion of this company you've been working with is just bought out, because that is often a red flag and something at least you need to be paying attention to, what the motivations and the financial situation is of the company that bought it.
That's that's probably a solvable problem right there. I mean, that's a good app idea for somebody you just called out.
Yeah. All right. So I'm a technologist. I love my tech and I love my toys. I love the internet, but there are bad things out there. And so they are even worse when you start involving kids. So before we leave this topic, I want to talk about a couple of those. And social media obviously is one that there's been a lot of studies. There's been a lot of speculation on how it has impacted us. And it's no doubt that it has. But it's still fuzzy, I think, exactly how it has impacted kids. But I don't think it's a stretch to say in some ways it's not good. So realizing this, countries and states have been trying to limit access to social media. In some cases, completely restrict it. And of course, they're doing it based on age, because they assume at some point you're old enough to handle it, and we arbitrarily pick that age. And then now we have to enforce that. Well, to enforce that, we have to collect everybody's age. And to do that well, or to do that in a verifiable way, we usually have to do face scans or upload government IDs. And that information, we've already seen how this information has gotten loose. And so there's a whole other issue of whether or not that's effective. Then the second part of that is, well, if you're going to do it, you got to keep it secure. So if we're going to restrict access by age and expect either our devices or the app stores or the apps themselves somehow somewhere along the line to enforce this, is there a privacy preserving way to do that?
It's a really good question. And it's something that we don't necessarily face that exact problem, because a lot of the services that we at Yahoo offer aren't necessarily age gated. There are obviously COPA and other regulations that we adhere to and that are really important to us. But we're also not offering services like the ones that you're probably describing, where, we have to think about the types of, user generated content, for example. But, we do like verify users who are recovering accounts, for example. And so we do think about how we are encountering identity documents and things like that. I might draw an analogy of a potential solution. Like the concept of passkeys for authentication is so good. And I was for a long time a physical security key user, and I still am for a few things, but I've mostly converted a lot of those high security use cases to passkeys. And in passkeys, like I have, a laptop right next to me that has a biometric fingerprint sensor on it. I can use that to authenticate to all sorts of websites all over the internet. And those websites never get my biometrics. They don't know my fingerprint. They don't know my face, the contours of my face, or any other biometric information about me. They just have a cryptographic assurance that I am who I say I am based on this chain of trust that I've created on my local device. And so if we can think about age verification in a similar way, obviously it puts the onus on the device, manufacturers, the operating system manufacturers to build something like that. but that would be a lot more secure than passing around, scans of identity documents, which can be altered, especially in a generative AI, scenario that we're in now, and they can be lost and stolen. So, I think it would be a really neat thing to see over the next few years, a similar effort like we had for passkeys.
Let me dig on that a little bit, because I think you're right, and I think there's a lot of issues with age gating, and I don't want to get into that necessarily now, but if we're going to do it, and I think it's going to be mandated somewhere, I think you're right. I think that the most logical place to enforce that is probably at the OS, when we've got TPMs and secure enclaves and these passkey type hardware technologies where this information can be embedded in the phone and not pulled out, but it can be queried. And so we could do things like maybe zero knowledge proofs, or we could do things like, instead of how old are you, it's like, are you older than this age? Yes or no. Binary questions that don't give away any more information than that. Are you over 18, or are whatever the magic age is for this thing? So I think that's an interesting thing to do. But I know Apple is also considering things like, when you set up a phone for a child, the parent declares the age of the child or an age range of the child. What's your take on that angle? Do you think that makes sense? Because, for example, let's say you, as a parent, your children are different ages, but they're also different emotional ages. And and as a parent, I think you were probably the one best able to make that call for your kid. So I think that is an interesting angle of this, where it's really the parent say, okay, this is a child's phone. I've declared it's a child's phone. I'm the parent of this child, and I want to say that this child can access stuff for this age range. Does that speak to you at all as a parent?
I think it does, because I think, one of the things that you want to encourage with your kids is, having sort of open and transparent conversations about what the dangers are, what are the things that they should be accessing given their, not just their physical age, but their, like you said, the sort of social emotional age. What are the risks of sort of going beyond that before you're really ready? Because the internet, as you said, is forever. But so again, like my kids, my older two kids do have devices, and one of those kids has an Apple device. And if they want to install an app, there's actually a prompt that appears on the parent phone that says, do you approve this? And I think giving the agency to the parent to say, yes, I think this is true, I think that is very powerful. Now, obviously, you have to sort of, if you extend that to an age gating scenario on a website where you must be a certain age to pass, basically, you must be this tall to ride sort of thing,
right? Yeah.
Then there has to be that sort of chain of trust that extends to the parent, and somehow that's validated. But let's say you can do that, then I think having the parents actually be involved in that process to say, yes, my child is this age, and not only am I agreeing to this, but I'm also affirmatively involved in this access. I think it's important. Now, obviously, there are lots of situations where a child may be not wanting to share it with their parents, and that could be perfectly fine. Thinking of kids who might be in situations that are unsafe for them, or not comfortable disclosing gender or sexual preferences and things. We got to make sure we are able to account for those type of really important cases.
Yeah.
But as a whole, as a parent, I do like the ability to have, sort of an affirmative role to play in saying, yes, that my child is that age and can access this site.
Yeah. And that was definitely one of the ones that I was alluding to when I said there's some problems with age gating. There's several, but that's a key one. Quick aside, I'm curious. I've heard that kids today that there's a little bit of a tech clash. Some kids are actually avoiding screens. Do you see that either with your kids or their friends? Are they like, you know what, go give me a dumb phone? Is that a thing?
It is a thing, and my kids don't do that, but I do know kids who do that.
Okay.
It's sort of like, I think there's a few different dimensions in there. There's a skepticism, because I would say when I was my kid's age, the future was limitless. I was, I watched Star Trek. I was a huge Trekkie. And if you look at the Star Trek universe, like, humanity has risen above and is now, harmonious, and we're united, and we're solving and exploring, and, everything is great, at least in sort of classic, the new stuff is definitely a little darker. I think kids now, there's been some situations and recent events where clearly technology has not always been the salvation or, the promised future that we thought we were going to have. And I think there's some skepticism and some, which is healthy, to be honest, that's part of it. I think there's also a desire to just have that retro kind of rebellious,
Yes.
aspect too. My kids, the thing that they're a little skeptical of is actually generative AI. And one of the reasons there is my oldest kid is an illustrator and really interested in art and in making art. And they are concerned about not their livelihood and future livelihood, but just about like the quality of art and how good is it. And so, and then also, like many of us, AI kind of feels like it's being shoved down our throats. And I will say, selfless corporate plug, I will say that I think that's not the strategy that Yahoo is taking. I think, we're taking a measured, smart approach to when we bring AI into a user's experience, and we're not like, you have to use it now. But I think there are a lot of situations where people don't want to use AI and they're being forced to. And there's ecological aspects to that. There's technology aspects. My son is very upset at RAM prices right now.
Oh, yes. I think we all are, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm seeing that more than I'm seeing the like total avoidance of screens. But screen use is something that I constantly am engaging with my kids on. And it's more like conversations. It's like, should we be we could be doing screens, but like, what if we played, a game of Magic: The Gathering together or something, or, a board game or something together instead of isolated. I find more success with like offering an alternative than just a strict thou shalt not, because my hacker son especially is very excited about like looking to circumvent the blocks I'm putting into place for his Wi-Fi access or whatever.
It becomes a challenge.
It does.
Exactly. Someone was telling me the other day, it's like, well, if you're not sure how to do it, tell your kid they can't, and then see how they figure out how to do it.
100%.
All right. So let's talk about something like the worst of the worst has got to be CSAM, child sexual abuse material. And, related to that certainly are things like non-consensual sexual stuff. And certainly in the age of AI, it's just gotten worse with deepfakes and things like that. It's gotten, and the undressing apps and things like that. Anyway. So, and I totally understand how we want to solve this problem. I can understand how politicians are under pressure from their constituents, and certainly they just want to look like they're protecting the kids, do it for the kids. I get it. But as always, the devil's in the details, and I feel that we're still turning to a lot of solutions that are not the way to go, even though they seem like easy solutions. And a lot of times that comes down to usually for a while it was breaking encryption. Like, you need to be able to make encryption that we can tap into so we can see what everybody's up to, so we can catch the bad guys. And then there was a lot of pushback on that. In fact, I thought we beat that in the 90s with the first crypto wars, but anyway. And then it became, okay, fine, we won't break the encryption. Instead, we just want to scan what's on your devices and then have your devices tattle on you if it finds something objectionable. But like a lot of these kind of solutions, it's similar to the one we just talked about with the kids, is the people that are going to defeat this are the bad guys. They know how to work around this stuff. Same with the age verification laws. You just use a VPN. And they got to ban VPNs too. I mean, sometimes it's the technical solutions are not there. And the other thing I'd like to point out too is that none of this stuff stops the original crime. It just stops the sharing of the results of these crimes. So we're not even really getting at the root problems here. So again, I'm going to challenge you with an impossible question. Is there a better technical solution than requiring access to everybody's devices and data to solve these kinds of really thorny, horrific problems?
Thorny is right, and horrific is right. CSAM is something that I have, and for those who are listening, CSAM is child sexual abuse material. CSAM is something that I've spent the majority of my career fighting against back in the government, certainly investigating my share of those cases, leading to prosecutions, and then in the private sector as well. In fact, I've gone and testified even as CISO in federal cases, both suppression hearings and jury trials. And it's so complicated. And I would say I'm not a lawyer, but there are some very good lawyers out there who think a lot about these problems. And I'm thinking of like Oren Kerr, who is I think UC Berkeley professor who writes a lot about the Fourth Amendment. And certainly, that's a U.S. Constitution issue. So international doesn't always apply internationally. But and Rihanna, and I'm probably going to say her name wrong, Pfefferkorn.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, and somebody who thinks deeply about CSAM and a lot of the legal challenges there. I will say it's something that I think very deeply about, and I feel fortunate that being the CISO of Yahoo, I'm actually able to engage with policymakers. I've gone to Capitol Hill. I've talked to members of Congress about some of the legal and latest light of proposals they've had. And the thing that's really important is we need to make sure that we're not requiring, like a lot of the proposals are doing things like requiring companies to do certain things. And the problem is if you do that, you make the company an agent of the government, and that violates the Fourth Amendment. And in that case, you're actually creating more headache and more problem. And also, there are, I don't recall the latest stats from NCMEC, and NCMEC being the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but there are millions and millions of what are called cyber tips that are generated every single year from tech companies. And it vastly exceeds the ability of law enforcement around the world to investigate. And so what I've been saying to the members of Congress I've been meeting with is, instead of focusing on more cyber tips and requiring platforms to do more and more scanning, which has constitutional implications, let's instead make sure that the NGOs, the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces all around the country, are they resourced appropriately to even handle? Are they trained appropriately to handle the influx of tips that are coming in? And I think that's where a lot of the value can be. And I think it's where we can also agree as technologists and engineers, and then policymakers, that there's a ton of impact that we can have there.
Yeah, that is a really tricky problem, and I certainly understand the desire to want to have access to all that data and catch everybody, and but the privacy aspects, to me, the being in the panopticon where you're constantly being surveilled, and who decides? I mean, because as soon as this technology is available for CSAM, it's also going to be available in countries where they think that homosexuality should be also reported,
right? Or
other things that it's a very slippery slope, and I have yet to come up with, or yet to find a technical solution to this that I think preserves our privacy rights.
So one of the things that I tell people is, well, Yahoo, like many tech companies, like most tech companies, we're international. We have an international audience. And so even though quite a while ago now, I was a U.S. federal law enforcement officer, to be honest, I consider in many cases that that governments could be an adversary, just like, the cyber criminals that we're trying to defend our users against, and cyber spies and such. And it is a slippery slope, providing, breaking encryption as a great example. Encryption is really important. It makes the internet work.
Yes.
You couldn't do online banking. You couldn't do a lot of things without the encryption that is provided. And the ability to be able to communicate securely is super important too, especially as we look at what's happening, today in places like Iran or Minnesota, that it's really important to have secure communications. And there's not really a technological way, cryptographically sound way, to break encryption for just one use case, but not the other use cases. So I totally agree. It's really difficult. And I will also say that, as putting now sort of like my former law enforcement hat back on, there was always, for decades, like you mentioned, the sort of like original crypto wars and the Clipper chip and that sort of thing, like have always been this sort of going dark challenge. And there's always a way that the government and governments are able to use other information, whether it's metadata or other information, to still satisfy their requirements and still investigate crimes and still prevent, bad things from happening, like terrorist attacks. So I think sacrificing everybody's privacy is not the answer, and it's important to hold that line.
That brings up something that I often like to refer to as a scaling difference. It is when you've got the technology to scan everybody all the time, that is a very different thing than having individual humans with their limited amount of time doing stakeouts, doing investigations. The scaling difference that is important. And doing it automatically for everybody, whether you're under suspicion or not, is a very different beast than doing the detective work and the gumshoe work that we used to have to do before we had these tools available to us to infiltrate these groups, to do the law enforcement and investigative techniques that we did before we had these tools available, and still relying on those because they tend to be more limited just because they're human limited and they're not computer scale tools.
Yeah. But I will say, I think there's a lot of broad agreement within technology companies and folks in my position, other CISOs, that we all want our platforms to be safer, and we all want consumers and the most vulnerable among us to be safe. And so we may differ on the tactics, but the overall end goal of a safer world and less abuse and less harm is shared by by everybody, I think. And so we just need to figure out how to get there in a way that, preserves everyone's privacy.
Yeah. All right. So you've already alluded to your background as law enforcement. So I'd like to talk about some of that next. You've worked on e-crimes, as you called it. And so you've worked on both sides of this. You've worked both for the companies that may have some data that investigators might want to get a hold of, and you're coming at it from the law enforcement side where you need to forensics and you need to be able to solve crimes. You worked at NASA, which that's super cool. So why don't you give us a little bit about your experience at NASA and, what kind of cases you worked on when you're doing law enforcement at NASA? I'm just curious. And what were some of the technical challenges coming from the other side of this, doing these investigations?
Yeah. Okay. So hearing NASA, you think like, what, are you space police or something?
Right.
So it's the United States law enforcement system is weird.
It is.
And there are hundreds of federal law enforcement agencies that all have statutory authority, and they can make arrests and they carry firearms, and they can serve warrants, and they represent all sorts of weird parts of the government.
That's like this. What is it? The Secret Service is in charge of counterfeiting, which you wouldn't, you think of the Secret Service as the guy jumping in front of the bullet for the president, but for whatever reason, counterfeiting falls under them too.
Right, and it's because they were part of the Treasury Department back in the day. So every federal agency, whether it's the State Department, Department of Education, or Energy, USDA, they all have what's called an Office of Inspector General. And that was back in the 1970s, what's called the OIGs were created to root out fraud, waste, and abuse within federal agencies. Now, some agencies like Department of Energy, like NASA, like DOD, they have really sophisticated and complicated IT infrastructures. For NASA, it's like supercomputers and systems that are controlling propulsion on orbiting spacecraft and, deep space telecommunications networks and such. And a lot of those OIGs have created specific cyber crime teams that really are there to investigate crime that affects the operation of the agency in the cyber domain. And so things that I worked on, if there was like a malware infection or any sort of crime affecting a NASA computer or system or employee even, that was sort of like the jurisdiction that we would have to be able to work those cases. So now NASA is an interesting beast, because if you think about NASA was like a university. And I used to, before coming to NASA, I actually worked cybersecurity at a university doing, network security and things like that. And there were a lot of NASA had a lot of researchers and folks who were focused really on academic and sort of acquisition of knowledge. And cybersecurity wasn't maybe their first priority. And so you would have a lot of situations where hackers would break into systems that were under somebody's desk that might have been hooked up to spacecraft in space, but maybe hadn't been patched in a couple of years. And then in many cases, the hackers were specifically trying to break into NASA. There was a bunch of Romanian kids who loved breaking into NASA and then going on to, if you remember IRC, they would go onto Internet Relay Chat and say, look, I hacked a NASA.gov box, and their connection would come from that. And everyone would be like, wow, very cool, street cred. And then over time, just like cybercrime as a whole, we started to see less sort of hacks for street cred or for showing off or for fun, and more professionalism and profit-driven hacks. And so toward the end of my time at NASA, and I was an agent only for 7 years, so not too long, I ended up working on large-scale botnets where maybe there were like 20 NASA computers in a botnet of like 20 million, but that was still enough nexus that we could, investigate that crime. And in many cases, going all over the world and identifying hackers, and in some cases, like taking, working with international law enforcement to arrest them, extradite them to the U.S., taking their money, dismantling their networks, things like that. So I was the nerdiest federal agent you probably had ever met. And I was a geek doing a lot of forensics and a lot of log reviews and, looking at forensic artifacts on servers. But then there was a lot of filing search warrants and subpoenas and court orders to follow the digital trail as it sort of traversed the internet. And then working with partners, whether they were international partners, whether there were folks in industry like antivirus researchers or cybersecurity researchers, or even academics, folks, who were collecting large amounts of open source data for research projects, collaborating on some of the biggest threats of the internet. Super fun. Like, it was just a really great time.
Was your group in charge of defending against like cyber espionage for NASA, like for space secrets, or trying to install malware on satellites, or was did that fall like NSA or somebody?
No, that was also us. Primarily, we focused on cyber criminals, but certainly there's a lot, and certain parts of the world, like Russia and China, there's not a really bright line between cybercrime and cyber espionage, and it's often the same people kind of moving back and forth between those two worlds. And so a lot of the criminal cases we would work might move into that cyber espionage or counterintelligence realm, or vice versa. They might start out that way and then move into cybercrime. So certainly myself and my colleagues, and by the way, when I say colleagues, it's important to note at NASA OIG, there were about 60 agents for the whole country, and only about 15 or so of those were cyber. And so we were very busy, but we always worked in partnership with other agencies. And so whether it was the Secret Service, the FBI, other OIGs, the military investigative units like the Air Force OSI or Army CID, we were very sort of like focused on partnerships and on helping the broader community, whether that be, the cybercrime fighting community in the public and private sector, really trying to see where we can use, our sort of time and expertise to make a bigger impact.
All right. Well, I have the rare opportunity of talking to somebody for a big internet company. We in the privacy community love to beat up on big tech when it comes to data hoarding and gathering as much data on their users as possible. And I'm not an apologist, but I understand that we're in a capitalist society, and public companies have to, if there's money on the table, the shareholder is going to say, pick that up. And so it's hard to ignore the monetization of user data. So, and you don't have to give me the official Yahoo line, but I know you talk to other CISOs as well. And I'm just curious, from the inside, what is the view about data minimization? Where are we at with that? Are companies finally starting to get religion and trying to, maybe not treating user data like gold and more like toxic waste, like collect as little as possible and keep it for as little as possible? What is, from the inside, please give us the perspective of where you think things are at today on that.
So the analogy you just used, the toxic waste, is exactly one that I use internally. And so I like to say, and you've probably heard this before, you can think of data in two ways. One is an oil. It's a very valuable resource and you want to acquire it and you can leverage it and make it into all sorts of cool things. But the other is like plutonium. And so if you think about plutonium, if there's a spill, you want to like bring in people who know what they're doing, who've, they've got the suits on and they can clean it up. And you as a person, like let's say you're an engineer at a company, you're not a security person, and you encounter user data, just like plutonium, you want to run the other way. You don't want to be anywhere near that because it's not safe to handle. And so the sort of duality of data as the engine of monetization, but as something that is we have to protect is what I spend a lot of my time doing as a CISO, is really talking to teams about the complexities and the subtleties of how to use and think about data. And yeah, I think, and also the more data you have, the more you might be compelled to turn over that data to a government or for a purpose that you may not agree with. And so, we definitely, minimizing the data we have reduces risk. And also, in the era of everything's cloud-based right now, like as a company, you're paying for storing that data.
True.
And that could be expensive. So there could be a monetary reason as well to focus on, slimming down your holdings and making sure you're only retaining what you need for as long as you need it. And also like taking steps to anonymize that data. And there's really a sophisticated, both at the federal, at the state level in the US, and then also looking at our friends in Europe, there's a significant regulatory regime that's been stood up that governs a lot of aspects of personal identifying information and consumer data. And, it's really complicated to stay in compliance. If you're retaining a lot of data, the easiest way is to keep as little as possible, and then it's really easy to comply.
Well, and even if you trust the company collecting the data completely, even if you trust that the making it available to your local law enforcement, and you trust that process, even if you go that far, it still makes you, the more you have, the more target you're going to be for foreign espionage or foreign governments who will try to steal that data. So it's even if you give the first two, just given the first two, you still have the problem of this last thing. That is another reason not to hold on to a lot of data and not to hold it any longer than you have to.
Yeah, exactly right. Don't make yourself more of a target than you need to be.
And I like to use plutonium because that's another, when I teach my class, I often use that same example. And I like the idea of something radioactive because it also has a half-life. And one thing I do tell people like, oh, my data's out there. It's pointless to stop sharing now. Like, well, it gets stale. Like the data they have on you is great, but at some point it's no longer valuable to them either because it gets stale. And
so actually, if I can talk about that for a second, one of the things with our employees that we do is we will do like digital footprint assessments of our employees, and we'll show them what data is available on them.
Oh, that's great.
On the internet. And we actually offer some tools, and I don't want to name specific tools, but we offer tools to our employees to reduce that digital footprint as part of like a benefit of being in the company. But it also helps them be like, wow, like these data brokers, these social networks, these financial sites, they have this information on me, and you can just get it. And that was the password I used, 10 years ago, or that password is still valid. And so we really focus a lot on, as the paranoids with our employees, we actually try to make it personal to them. Like, hey, let's help you secure your own stuff. And,
that's fantastic.
That then helps them think about and, be a little paranoid about how they're entrusting, the data of our consumers.
Oh, that's right. I love that. That's fantastic. All right. One more big question before we go. You've alluded to this earlier as well. I talk a lot about this data hoarding in the sense of law enforcement access. And I know there are, to varying degrees, relationships between law enforcement and companies, some of them formal, some of them not. But it comes down to you said it yourself earlier, bypassing the Fourth Amendment is getting this stuff where normally they might have to get a court order to get this. A lot of times they could just buy it directly. So how do we close that loophole? Is it just regulation? Is it, because it seems a little bit too loose right now. There's too much easy access for if you flash I'm a private investigator credential, or with minimal authorization, I can go to some of these companies and get a lot of data on people that I probably shouldn't have access to. What do we do about that?
I think it really depends on the type of company we're talking about. So tech companies in, let's say, Yahoo space, for example, like you can't do that. You can't flash a private investigator badge and get anything. There is a very strict process over governing like what we can release, to law enforcement, to parties that might, maybe a judge's order is authorizing some sort of information release. Our default approach is protecting the consumers and the user's privacy, at all costs. And only if we are forced to, with some sort of subpoena or some other type of legal process, as a U.S. company, then we might have to turn certain items over. And, actually Yahoo has had a historic sort of a history of fighting against overbroad surveillance and overbroad requests for user data in court and, really minimizing what we have to turn over. And again, this is something I've seen both sides of this. Like, when I was at NASA, like when I actually came to Yahoo and was sort of getting introduced to people, some of the people on the legal team were like, I remember your name. Like, you've served us with like search warrants and subpoenas. And I did a lot of that. But yeah, I think keeping in mind that we are users entrust us with their digital lives, and we have to honor that trust, and we have to be that, that trusted guide and make sure that part of that is, not betraying that trust. And so fighting for our users, making sure that we're able to resist those, overbroad requests for government data. I feel really good about that. And I also would never say that we work with law enforcement. That because, again, we're talking Fourth Amendment issues, we're talking parts of the world or our users who are uncomfortable with that type of relationship. And we've seen, thinking back to Snowden, where the NSA, according to the documents that were released, was tapping the data centers of Google and Yahoo. Those are not always our friends, and they could be our adversaries. And so we have to design our security mechanisms with governments in mind as adversaries, even governments where we may have locations and offices or physically reside, like myself, being here in Washington, D.C., in fact. So, yeah, I could talk about this for hours probably, but I do think, speaking for the sector that I work in, and I know the practices of my peer companies as well, there is very strict controls on what we release to governments or other people doing investigations. But there are classes of data brokers and sites that make commercial data available where those rules may not apply.
Well, just to put a fine point on that, and by the way, kudos for being one of the companies that is adopting those policies. But my guess is those are policies you chose. Other companies could choose differently, right? How much of that is based on laws and regulations versus we believe in privacy and this company's not going to do that?
So in the United States, there's two primary federal laws that actually govern what we can provide and what we can turn over, whether it's to law enforcement or to other governmental agencies or even private parties. And those are primarily the Stored Communications Act and the Electronic and Communications Privacy Act, or what's called ECPA. SCA and ECPA are the primary laws that govern how we can respond to requests for data. And they were, written back in the 80s, updated a couple times, but still, they focus on making sure that we aren't, too friendly with law enforcement, and that we're not turning over information that could, impact the privacy of our users, and making sure, to be honest, that law enforcement does what they're supposed to do. It's funny, like some of my good friends are actually defense attorneys, and I think defense attorneys, and I know this view is not always shared amongst those who have come from law enforcement, but defense attorneys keep cops honest, and they make sure that the cops don't take shortcuts. And I feel like, in some ways, that's kind of what we do as well. Like there's a way that they're supposed to operate. And if they don't do that way, it's violating the rights of our users. And a good court worth their salt will, frankly, toss that case out because the constitutional rights were invalidated. So one thing, and I guess sort of to put a pin on, like you just said, Yahoo's been around for 30 years, and which is nuts to say, but like I love working in a company that's been around that long. And one of the reasons I love it is because people have trusted us for that length of time to protect their data, to be a part of their daily lives. And, they want to know that we're doing right by them. And so whether they're like interacting with Yahoo Mail, or they're doing fantasy sports, or, they're looking up tickers on Yahoo Finance, like they trust us to keep their information safe, and we need to honor that trust.
All right. Well, before we go, what's on the horizon for you and your paranoids? And as a parting shot, a wide open question, do you have any other tips or advice for the audience?
Yeah. So, I think this year, like last year, a lot of it is like, what's the smart use of AI? What's the intelligent use of AI? And Yahoo is not a company, and I'm not a leader who really focuses on like AI will solve all problems. I think AI is a great way to empower people to maybe reduce some toil and free up time for them to be creative. But I never want to take a person out of the equation. I don't see AI as like great, now I can eliminate all these jobs. No. But, human creativity and experience and judgment, these will always have an important role in technology. And like, so AI is, I think the focusing on that aspect of it is what's going to keep me busy. And the reason is because, frankly, we're bringing more AI into how the paranoids operate on a daily basis, and how we do our tasks, and how we make things easier for our engineers who are shipping and deploying code every day to, follow the most safest software development lifecycle practices, for example, and, integrate security into their code, not just, as a bolt on afterwards, but like from that sort of architecture
Yes.
and that initial design phase.
Absolutely.
If we do it right, then that's like making it just seamless. That's the thing that I think AI will help us with the most.
All right, Sean, that was very fascinating. Thanks for coming on the show. It was great to talk to you.
Super great to be here. Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Sean for coming on the show. That was a really interesting discussion. I'd love to have him back again in the future. He's got a very diverse background and therefore has some interesting perspectives on things that we don't often get. On Thursday, the patrons will get some bonus Q&A with Sean. We talk a little bit about what it was like becoming CISO during the pandemic. He literally started that job on March of 2020, right when the global pandemic was declared. And so I asked him what that experience was like. And we talk a little bit about what we call secret squirrels, which you can look up that concept. I'll put a link in the show notes. That phrase has an interesting history with spooks and spies and a cartoon from Hanna-Barbera, but it's come to have a specific meaning in the intelligence community and the security community. And so I asked him what his take on that phrase is, because they've used it in some of their podcasts. And then finally, I asked him about some of his interesting experiences in law enforcement, and he talked to us about Operation Ghost Click, which took down the DNS changer malware operation. And that was a very interesting story. So the patrons will get that bonus content on Thursday as usual. All right, so I do have a little extra time today, so I want to talk about the highlights from the listener survey. I'm not going to go through everything. There was a lot of responses, but I did want to touch off a few things that came from there just to let you know that A, I read it, and B, what I'm thinking about doing about it. So here are a few highlights from some of the comments I got. First of all, if there's a story that you think I should cover or just want to help me be aware of, particularly stories outside the U.S., which might be harder for me to find or easier to miss, depending on how you look at it, please let me know. I definitely want to cover stuff outside the U.S. as well, and I try to find those stories, but as you might imagine, it's a little harder for me to find those, especially some of the deeper cuts. So if you're interested, send me an email. Let's make it easy. Send it to news@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com, or if you want, if you're on social media, you can just tag me on social media and I'll see it there as well. I've actually already got some listeners that do that, and I appreciate it. So that is a great way to give me a heads up about something you think that might be interesting for the podcast. Second, I had at least a couple of people say, when I asked them how I could improve the podcast, they say improve the audio of my guests. There's only so much I can do about that. I actually have a very nice, tight prep guide that I send to all the guests before they come on with suggestions on how to maximize the quality of their audio. But, I can't force them to buy fancy equipment that costs hundreds of dollars. And to be honest, some guests, I don't think even read the prep guide or follow the advice. I do what I can. I do understand that is something that can be bothersome, and I do my best, sometimes even post-processing, to try to fix that audio where I can, but there's only so much I can do. All right, next up, several people suggested that I make videos. Some suggested that I turn this podcast into a video podcast. I've heard that for years. I totally understand. I know it's a popular thing. I get it, but I have zero intention of turning this main podcast into a video format. It's a whole different beast in terms of editing, and it's something I'm not going to go there. However, I have thought about doing some short videos separate from this podcast and putting those up on my YouTube channel, for example, or maybe putting some short clips on social media. I have considered doing that, and we'll see. I may do that. Another comment I got more than once was people telling me they would like to financially support what I'm doing, but they really don't want to join Patreon. And I totally get that. I fully understand, and I'm not surprised that several of you would say that. Just FYI, I do take cryptocurrency. I don't talk about it hardly ever, but if you go to the support button on my website, it's in the upper right, it's a big button, says support on it. There's also a menu for support. If you go there, there's 2 QR codes there, one for Monero and one for Bitcoin. So I just kind of treat that as a tip jar. If that is the way you'd like to go, if you would like to contribute to the cause but don't want to become a patron, that's a great way to do a one-time donation, and I would be happy to accept that. Someone else asked me if I'm going to be updating my book anytime soon. So the book is, I think it's 11 years old as of January. The first edition was 11 years ago. There's 5 editions now total. So we're on the 5th edition but that's 2 years old already. And it is due for an update. The operating systems have changed. The screenshots have changed. Some of the advice has changed, though a lot of that is still the same. But yes, I think I'm going to try to do one more solid update for the book and then leave it for a while. So I'm hoping to do a 6th edition sometime this year. I will keep you posted. But yes, I am planning hopefully to do an update sometime this year. So those are some of the highlights. Those are things that stuck out or things that multiple people said. So I wanted to let you know that I did read those comments and come back and tell you at least some initial thoughts I've had on those things. There were several other comments. I did read them all. Some of those things I'm still working on, some of the suggested guests and things like that. So never fear, I did read them, and if I can, in some way, I will try to address your feedback as much as possible. That said, I also get a lot of conflicting feedback. It's not uncommon, and this year was no different, where somebody says, I want more of this, and someone says, I want less of this, and it's the same thing. I obviously can't please everybody, and I'm kind of fixed on the format that I've got now. I kind of like it, but I do listen, and I do take it into account. You don't have to wait till January. If you've got a hot idea you want to send me, just send it to feedback@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. I will read that anytime. As I was reading through the survey responses, it really just kind of hit me that I've got a lot of big milestones this year. It's the 11th year of the book. It's going to be the 9th anniversary of the podcast in March, meaning I will have done this every week for 9 years. Pretty amazing. But the one I'm kind of hanging my hat on this year is the 500th episode of the podcast. That will come out in September. I will be inviting Bruce Schneier to come back because he's been here for every 100th episode so far, what I call the Pod Centennials. So I'm hoping he will be back again this year to celebrate the 500th. That's going to be a really big deal. And I'm trying to come up with some really fun stuff to promote that this year and some leading up to it. We'll have a countdown to 500. I'm going to do a social media tag, FDSD 500. You'll see that on a lot of my posts. And so I really want to do some fun, interesting promotions of the podcast this year, and you can help. So, whenever you see posts like that, repost, like, whatever, feel free to post on your own and tag me. That would be great. And I will try to come up with some really fun, new, novel promotion to celebrate the big 500th episode. So stay tuned. Okay, so we'll have a new show next week, as usual, and then we'll have my interview with Nick Merrill from Freely. That's a really interesting discussion. Then we'll be talking with a representative from Consumer Reports and More Perfect Union about their very interesting study on surveillance pricing. Nate and Jonah will be on the show from Privacy Guides. That's going to be a hoot. I've lined up 3 people to talk about fingerprinting on the internet and identity resolution, basically how we're tracked and identified on the web. And then soon after that should be my interviews with Carissa Valise about her new book called Prophecy, and Cindy Cohen from the EFF about her book and her time at the EFF and her illustrious career fighting for our rights. Lots of great stuff coming up. So tell your friends, spread the word, and if you haven't subscribed already, well then do that, and then you won't miss any of those great episodes. That'll do it for this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there, and until next time, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.